Okay, good afternoon, everyone. I'm sorry we can't see you yet, but I guess that'll change in a bit. Welcome to our panel on Bombay film color and the Cold War. I'd like to first briefly begin by introducing the speakers, but I'll be very brief because we have a very promising discussion ahead and I don't want to eat into that time. So let me start by introducing Ranjani Mazumdar, who's Professor of Cinema Studies at Jawaharlal Nehru University in Delhi and co-convener of the Bombay Film Color Research Network. She's the author of Bombay Cinema, an archive of the city, which was published in 2007 and is completing a manuscript right now on technology, travel, design, and color in 1960s Bombay cinema. Our next speaker is Kirsty Sinclair Dootson, who is lecturer in film and media at University College London, and along with Ranjani is co-convener of the Bombay Film Color Research Network. She specializes in the geopolitics of post-war color film technologies and the global history of Technicolor. She's the author of The Rainbow's Gravity, which was published in 2023. Our third speaker is Samhita Sunya, who's Associate Professor of Cinema in the Department of Middle Eastern and South Asian Languages and Cultures at the University of Virginia. She's author of Sirens of Modernity, World Cinema via Bombay, which was published in 2022, and is guest co-editor of a South by Southwest Asia special issue of Film History, published in 2020. Our fourth speaker is Josephine Diecke, who's Assistant Professor of Film Studies at the University of Zurich. Her research focuses on film color, East German film history, moving image preservation, and digital methods. She holds a PhD from Zurich on AGFA color and Orwo color and has researched extensively at the former AGFA Orwo headquarters in Wolfen. And finally, I'm the moderator, Sudha Rajagopalan. I actually teach at the University of Amsterdam, but I'm not in Amsterdam at the moment. I'm in European studies and I work on Soviet cultural history during the Cold War, and I look at films and other material cultural forms in transnational cultural entanglements. So we'll get started now with Ranjani. Over to you.
Okay. Key moments of industrial expansion in the 20th century have been chronicled across the world by photographers and cinematographers, and with these interventions came the recognition that the images where transformations are rendered visible to the world. Following India's independence, the country's first Prime Minister Jawaharlal Nehru directed the Press Information Bureau and Films Division of India, two important media institutions, to disseminate black and white photographs and newsreels documenting India's industrial progress for public consumption. Both organizations became responsible for the production and circulation of a visual aesthetic, a large collection of black and white stills and moving images of steel plants, hydraulic power stations, modern irrigation methods, a play with the human form and its relationship to technology, and large dams. While the Press Information Bureau disseminated their photographs through newspapers and magazines, the Films Division disseminated newsreels and shorts through mandatory screenings before the commercial feature in all theaters across the country. It is in this imagery that we clearly see the presence and influence of a Soviet-style visual iconography. Given India's strong ties with the Soviet Union since the mid-1950s and the influence the latter's planning methods had on Nehru, it is not surprising that documentation of change related to the Indian government's 5-year plans was considered equally important in conveying to its own people and the rest of the world the visual force of a nation's journey from poverty to economic modernization. Illustrated periodicals from the Soviet Union circulated in India both due to strong diplomatic ties and the presence of two large communist parties with direct links with the Soviet Communist Party. Sudha Rajagopalan provides a wonderful account of the circulation of Soviet books and magazines in her monograph on the circulation of Soviet objects. These magazines were available in libraries, bazaars, old bookshops, and the Soviet bookshops throughout India. Along with life and picture posts, Soviet magazines such as Sputnik and Soviet Land were widely distributed in multiple languages. The circulation of these magazines increased after the United States Information Services offices in India began publishing a magazine known as SPAN in 1960, which was distributed free of charge. SPAN promoted US-India cooperation by covering major diplomatic events, industrial and scientific breakthroughs, sports, art, architecture, and culture. The Soviets decided to push their print media circulation even more to counter Span's entry in India. This Cold War era competitive visual culture in an India without television was critical in the development of a fluid aesthetic that drew on both American and Soviet influences. The black and white images generated by the Press Information Bureau and the Films Division merged American visions of the industrial sublime with Soviet constructivism and socialist realism. This vast black and white archive of images was transformed and repurposed to new effect with the entry of color, especially Eastman color. The first Eastman color film, Hum Hindustani, We Are Indian, released in 1959, opened with dramatic Soviet style industry images in color, accompanied by a popular song about the future. In Admi or Insan, Man or Human, released 10 years later in 1969, a dam under construction is presented to forge both friendship bonds and conflicts. The dense mise en scène of the dam site emerges in the film as a colorful spectacle of coal, iron, river water, mountains, and a dedicated crowd of workers. The glorification and eulogizing of the laboring body of the worker is influenced by a socialist realist impulse and its commitment to the human condition and the human figure in visual representations. The use of graphic impressions to stage emotional conflicts is a nod to constructivist ideas, but with some variations. While Span featured photographs of factory sites and the construction of highways, bridges, and dams influenced by popular notions of the industrial sublime, in the US, magazines like Soviet Land and Sputnik carried photographs inspired by socialist realism and constructivism. We need to return to this Cold War era visual culture in India, a profoundly eclectic and complex visual aesthetic that shaped the landscape of 1960s Bombay cinema as it transitioned to color. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ranjani. Kirsty?
Thanks, Sudha. And I just wanted to start by extending an enormous thanks to the conference organizers. It is no mean feat to put together such a phenomenal lineup of global scholars working on global material. So thank you. I'm sorry I can't be there in Amsterdam with you all. I'm waving from Paris. And I'm hoping that many of you will be able to join us for the Bombay Film Colour Symposium that we are hosting in London in June. Please reach out if you want some details about that. So we were all asked to pick one object that raises questions about how we might kind of decenter kind of histories of the Cold War by recentering Bombay. And so I've picked this advertisement from Filmfare, which is a popular Indian film magazine, and it's an advertisement for Film Centre, which some of you will know was the first laboratory processing chromogenic monopack, as far as I know, anywhere outside of Europe or the US. Certainly the first in Asia. It beats Toyo Laboratories lab in Tokyo by a year. So I'm interested in this image because it raises a number of themes that I'm interested in the context of this panel, and that actually resonate with some of the conversations that have been happening earlier in the day around infrastructure and laboratories. So I'm interested in how we kind of think about laboratories in Cold War media networks, so how they become these kind of nodal points in the exchange of film. So Film Centre was kind of an Indian Belgian co-production. It was put together by Ambalal Patel with technical assistance from Givet. So I'm interested in, obviously, India is not aligned during the Cold War. How does kind of Belgium sit in that kind of equation, given the kind of complex intersections of decolonial and kind of Cold War politics that are happening? And I really enjoyed Ling Zhang's paper earlier, kind of thinking through these questions. So it raises questions about the role that laboratories played in these histories. You'll also see that the Film Centre processed a range of film stocks. So we have Jiva Colour, Agfa Colour, and Eastman Colour all advertised here. The lab was initially established just to process Jiva Colour. I'm very interested in kind of Jiva Colour's place in Cold War and global colour film history. I think it's a film stock that has perhaps been overlooked because it was never used in Hollywood. It's only sporadically used in France, but it was really important to color film histories in the global south, particularly India, but we know it was used in Malaysia, Sri Lanka, Thailand, China. I think one of the reasons that it's overlooked is because it was perceived, certainly by Indian cinematographers, to be of lower quality than something like Eastman color. Obviously, this advertisement isn't portraying that. It's showing this bright, vivid, saturated color. But this raises another kind of interesting theme for me, which is this idea of telling color film history through either low quality or marginal processes, as well as black and white images. And I was going to show a black and white image, and then I changed my mind because I really wanted to show something very beautiful and colorful, to kind of think through these histories of Bombay and the Cold War. And I'd love for us to kind of reflect more broadly across the conference about how the kinds of sources we choose inform the stories that we tell. And because in the kind of film history of Bombay, we often have archival absences. Many of the films processed at Film Centre from the 50s are not extant, or they're available in low quality. How do we tell that history without feeling the pressure to show beautiful color images like this one? And I'm really glad that when Josie speaks, she has a black and white image to kind of get at this issue. So just to kind of bring this together, the sort of issues that I'm interested in thinking through are this question of laboratories, this question of kind of laboratories working across the political spectrum of film stocks, questions of archival loss, how we tell these histories through lost objects or low quality images, particularly the role of Jiva color and the intersection of decolonial and Cold War politics, which I think has already been brought up at the conference so far. But I will stop speaking and hand over to the next speaker.
Thanks very much, Kirsty. Samhita?
Hello, everyone, again. Thank you all for being here. Thank you so much, especially to Kirsty and Ranjani for getting this panel together. This is a still image from a 1970 film, and my presentation is briefly distilled from the final chapter of my book, which is interested in this question of the legacies of 1960s or long 1960s Bombay cinema, and particularly through a feminist historiography that on many levels is thinking about politics of value, whether that's around polemics of art versus popular cinema, or how we approach this history of color, building on the earlier presentations, but now thinking about how material histories of, say, circulation of print material come together, or infrastructure come together with the affective associations with color. So this image that you're seeing here is a still where it's from a song sequence with a romancing couple, and the conceit of the song is that the man is dressed as a bangle seller with an array of colorful bangles and sort of offering them to his love interest. And there's one moment in the sequence where she very kind of sensuously chooses a bangle and slides it on her wrist. And the emphasis of the lyrics themselves are on bangles as being very, very colorful. So there's a whole amazing story about this in terms of affective associations with the plastic bangle, with sensuality in terms of color, women's choice, especially in this decade, a culture of consumption. And often this decade has been dismissed sometimes for its indulgences in escapism, romance. And of course, we should be critical of certain aspects of what those representations reify. But at the same time, I think there's also a politics, particularly in South Asia, of love itself that becomes really important to investigate in terms of sometimes the film's own ambivalence in a period both nationally and globally of such volatility, an economic crisis, and how films themselves were sort of wrestling with their own conditions, which on the surface, a clip like this or an image or a song sequence like this seems kind of facetious and silly or even escapist. But then underneath these levels, there's all this history contained in it. So very briefly, among one of the things that animates this period of the Cold War, is, of course, as we've heard before, like competing sort of soft power initiatives, whether between the US and USSR. You have sort of the non-aligned movement. But alongside this, then you have this question of what does the historiography of South-South film culture in this moment of color cinema, in the moment of the Cold War, look like? And there's a story of Bengals that's sort of wrapped up in this, which is that in this moment of deep economic crisis in India, the rupee was devalued after the mid 1960s. One of the plastic commodities that was bringing in huge amounts of foreign exchange was plastic bangles. And so these manufacturers, it was like one of the sort of highest manufactured commodity in terms of earning foreign exchange revenue. And one of the raw materials that was used for making these plastic bangles was waste celluloid. So what this gave way to, that came to light when it was caught, was a scheme by which blue films or exploitation films, ostensibly from the Middle East, were being imported in the guise of celluloid waste for the Bengal factories. And this was very hard to regulate. But what interests me about this story is two things. On the one hand, again, how these material histories, say of Bengals and smuggling in this case, or the associations with cinema have sort of mutually shaped each other in this very sort of colorful image of romance here. And then finally, how the politics of gender in all of this, while film import export might seem to be very like policy oriented, all the anxieties about this were often framed around regulations of femininity, sexuality in this moment. And you see some of that in the films themselves, and even the way in which a cliche for a bad film was send it to the Bengal factory, where then there's this hinging of devaluation with not only a trivial accessory, but a feminine one in particular. We can talk more about this, but I'll end there to give way to the next presentation and look forward to our conversation. Thank you again.
Thanks, Samhita. Josephine?
Thank you very much. Hello, everyone. So here is my object or image and story, as Kirsty has said, in beautiful black and white. So it's the 28th of January, 1965. We're in Bombay, now Mumbai, at the opening of an exhibition by the East German film manufacturer Orvo. A ribbon is being cut, but it's not a ribbon, it's a strip of film. The person doing the honors, celebrating the significance of the GDR's film exports for the Indian film industry, is Homi J.H. Talyarkhan, Maharashtra's Minister of Tourism. The company newspaper for the employees of the Orvo plant, called Filmfunken, printed this exact picture under the headline Orvo in Bombay, reporting in detail on the exhibition's opening ceremony. So the image caption refers to him simply as the Indian minister, but Talyarkhan, as noted in the article, was also an amateur filmmaker and thus clearly engaged, asking questions, inspecting photos, watching screenings. Not visible in the picture, the exhibition also featured extracts from DEFA documentaries and Indian feature films, a mini theater, an in-house studio for amateur testing, and a color quiz, all meant to showcase the quality of Orvo black and white and Orvo color film stocks. The photo is a carefully staged image of East German technological modernity, and on the surface it looks like a success, a socialist state presenting itself as an equal partner to a recently decolonized country with the world's largest film industry. But how did we get to this moment and what's behind it? To understand that, we need to rewind and zoom out, because this story doesn't begin in '65 in Bombay. This is what we learn from official accounts and stories passed down at the former AGFA and Orvo production site in Wolfenbitterfeld in what is now East Germany. In the late 1930s, a man named Dr. Klever from AGFA was already based in India, representing the company's interests. He returned to Germany in 1939 when the war broke out, and after the war, he returned to India almost immediately, an early sign that the German film industry maintained ambitions there, despite radically shifting political contexts. Meanwhile, in Wolfen, where the aquacolor process was developed in the mid-1930s, the plant came under Soviet control. Between 45 and 54, film production focused on supplying the USSR. Export to countries like India wasn't on the agenda. That changed in the mid-1950s. From 56, the GDR began planning for international expansion. India, with its enormous film production and screening infrastructure, was seen as both a major market and a valuable diplomatic partner. By the early 60s, East German representatives like Rudolf Bayer were stationed in India just before the Orvo brand was officially introduced in 64. So the 1965 exhibition in Bombay was both a culmination and a public showcase of this intensified relationship, a performance of smooth technological cooperation. And this is where the archive becomes so important. Last summer, Kirsty and I visited the archive in Wolfen, and what we found reflected the range and complexity of Indo-GDR film relations. There were export tables, internal memos, and technical specifications, but also more surprising materials, a photo album from the exhibition stop in Madras in April 65, and a full project file titled Project India, outlining an ambitious plan from 57 to 63 to establish a film stock production facility in India. Even more striking were internal reflections from 1960 on Indian aesthetic preferences, like notes suggesting that cinematographers were accustomed to cool color reproduction and therefore favored Eastman color, which allegedly shaped their reception to Orvo color. These materials show how industrial decision-making was guided not only by trade logics, but also by aesthetics and cultural assumptions. And among these archives materials was also the article Orvo in Bombay, which also included guest book entries from Indian visitors. Some were enthusiastic. One photographer wrote that Orvo film performed better than expected, but others were more cautious. One guest noted, "I'd love to try Orvo film, but I don't have a camera." Another added, "Please make it more affordable." A films division representative wrote that Orvo potentially offered a pleasant alternative to Kodak and Agfa. This kind of feedback reminds us that the circulation of color film wasn't just about chemistry or design, it was about access, infrastructure, and usability. Many of these frictions aren't visible in the official photo and not even in the archives. So this raises broader questions, both methodological and political. How do we study this material? Is close reading enough, or do we need other, maybe digital tools to trace patterns, visualize networks, or analyze technical evolution? What about more speculative approaches? And how do we bring in decolonial and critical perspectives, especially when dealing with Cold War era cultural diplomacy? Because what the 65 photo shows is a carefully staged moment of internationalism. What it doesn't show is what went wrong. The shipments that didn't arrive, the lab tests that failed, the frictions in translation, technical, economic, and cultural. And that's why we need to think the history of color film and the conditions of its production, circulation, and reception, not just as a technical or national story, but as a connected global history. One rooted in material processes, but also in economic structures, diplomatic performances, and cultural translations. A history where color isn't just seen, it's negotiated. Thank you.
Thank you so much, all four of you. I'd like to actually combine the two broad questions that I had in one to leave time for questions from the audience. And so what we see here with the four papers that we've heard so far, presentations, is essentially a decolonial look at color cinema, right? So we're recentering Bombay and we are decentering the West. So what does this do to our standard narratives of color cinema, but also standard narratives of Cold War cultural transactions and entanglements? And so perhaps I would just sort of skip to the second question and ask you to pick up from where Josephine left off. What does such a decolonial perspective involve in terms of looking for sources? So if we imagine the archive, the traditional archive as being the imperial archive, how do we decolonize that archive and perhaps reconceptualize the archive in terms of the kinds of sources that we look at in order to bring Bombay front and center in this history? And any of you can jump in at this point.
I'll happily jump in here, having just published something in Bioscope that thinks through some of these questions. And I think this is pertinent to me as someone who's previously worked on the history of Technicolor, which is probably one of the best archived, processes that we have. We have phenomenally restored prints. We have memos documenting everything. And so transitioning to then try and think about the kind of history of color in 1950s Bombay, which I was previously working on with Paul Vigor, who's part of the Bombay Film Colour Network, and I'm turning to work with Josie on this question. Going to the National Film Archives of India and being really struck by the difference in terms of what is available, right? And this is, I'm not answering your question, I'm kind of just reiterating it, the importance of it, of having to completely transition methodologies, right? Completely changing the way that we do film history to, particularly someone who's trained in art history, decenter visual analysis. And I found myself, when I was picking my object, again, I'm going to pick the beautiful thing because we all want to look at gorgeous objects, right? But having to kind of untrain that learning, and the centrality of visual analysis as well was something for me that really came out, was that sometimes there is no object for you to analyze, so there is no aesthetic payoff. And I think for me, as someone who came from art history into film studies, the idea that there's not an aesthetic payoff is very difficult to grapple with. I'm going to kind of throw it back out. So I think I'm just reiterating the importance of the question and the importance of different methods rather than having a smart answer. But I'll throw that out to other folks who are also thinking about these questions.
I can go next. Yeah, so I think that, as all of us probably know, in the question of kind of world film historiography in this period, the anecdotal memory of Bombay cinema outside of India is enormous. It's so profuse, like over a huge stretch of the globe, and how kind of the gap between that and its historiography in terms of accounts of that in the scholarship there's a huge gulf. So I think that's one of the stakes of this sort of decolonial look and recentering Bombay. Another is that I think for very understandable reasons right now, there can be sometimes a nostalgia for sort of histories of left movements and left popular cultures in the 50s and also bleeding into the 60s. But I also think that there were a lot of blind spots from a feminist historiography perspective in terms of that global sort of left history, and recovering some of the friction points and debates and ambivalences there feels really important. So how that's wrapped up with color is sometimes color in Bombay cinema became so associated in the 60s with the indulgence and over capitalist commercialism of romance. And so there's a lot of suspicion of popular Bombay cinema in the 60s, again, in these art versus popular versus avant-garde polemics. But then again, the films themselves wrestled with that ambivalence where there was sort of pressure to sort of make hits under such constrained, volatile circumstances that affect both art cinema and the popular. And then, of course, in South Asia, thinking of the politics of love and the sort of political radicality of that, I think is very important to recover. And we see ideologically how a lot of these films are wrestling with that through, say, melodramas of desire versus duty. And often sort of the kind of left ideological perspective was put aside the personal for, the world building or like, but that's also that kind of can be, there's a sort of feminist critique of that in terms of like the politics of value. Romance is so tied to social reproduction that maintains all kinds of hierarchies.
Yes, I was actually struck by that in the difference between your image and the ones that Ranjani showed us, right? Because Ranjani's very much support this idea of color in congruence with socialist realism or whatever post-colonial imperatives were in India at the time. And then you have the shift to the more intimate, the more effective in the 60s with your image. But thanks very much for that, Samhita. Josephine, did you want to address that point as well?
Yeah, maybe when it comes to like what we can do also as researchers, and I think it has a lot to do also with going against dominant narratives and also, being the person who asks the difficult questions, and especially at archives where history or like the files are not labeled in a way that you might look for. So for instance, in the case that Kirsty and I are exploring right now with Wolfin and ACFA, it's really like you don't look for color history, color film history, but you look for India or you look for relationships. And it's just the way of asking questions differently. And then also because I think it was addressed this morning in terms of for restoration ethics, like what can you do to go against this overabundance of images and maybe not knowing what is true and what is fake. And it was mentioned that one way is, of course, contextualizing and documenting, but I'm also really thinking you have to bring the questions also to these pieces and to these situations that cannot be answered easily. And, you know, that it should also be part of the documentation. So maybe to just address these two things, but also, of course, highlighting different voices, like bringing different people into the discussion. These are ways I think we can contribute to decolonial approaches.
Yeah, I think a lot rides on also reimagining film industry and film cultures also through informal circuits, you know, which kind of like with, I think, was it Samhita in your presentation, you talked about the pirated pictures or copies, was it the pirated videos? So I'm thinking that that perhaps also contributes a great deal to shifting from a sort of previously imperial or colonial perspective as well. I have one more question, but maybe we also need to
Can
take.
I also?
Yeah, please, Ranjani, go ahead.
So I just wanted to say that one of the ways in which I have found the archives in India very restrictive is because of the overwhelming focus on the practice of directors and the role of stardom, which has really left out the whole terrain of practitioners who worked in labs, cinematographers, designers, actually who dealt with the material transformation of color. And for this, I found it very, what has been useful for me during the course of my research is that I've had to deal with oral history because the archive doesn't have this history. And one of the things that Kirsty and I have tried to do is to generate something that we are actually producing a history. And this oral history, to a large extent, is like chasing the dead. And their family members or those who were associated with these practitioners to get bits and pieces of how they dealt with that context and try to recover something of a trace of that period, which was an intensified experience because when you have this kind of chromatic surge after a black and white moment in a country which is already saturated in color, that is a moment that needs to be recovered to a large extent, and it's become so naturalized now that we have to estrange ourselves again to go back to that moment to trace that. So I think part of the decolonial project, if that exists, I'm not very happy with the term, is that we have to look for histories that are not there in the archive and then enmesh them with what is available.
I guess one question that we could touch upon before we take questions from the audience is also understanding what this does to our view of Cold War histories and Cold War cultures, right, at this time, because what we essentially do when we do the kinds of histories, the kinds of things that Josephine talks about as well, is that we disrupt these binaries that are in place. So perhaps we could take one comment on that before we go to the audience, whoever wishes to do so.
I'm going to nominate Samhita.
I mean, I guess again, just the attention to different kinds of histories that come together, like institutional histories, sort of what's in the formal archive, and then oral histories that open up these like really, really robust routes of informal economies, practices of trade, travel, exchange that include and sort of intersect with the sort of more bipolar understandings of the Cold War, but also really go beyond that in terms of I think, again, like what's so interesting about this moment is this very palpable sense, both nationally and internationally, of a world order that was kind of up in the air. And there's, I think, a poignancy of that moment that feels very important to recover from sort of different locations and perspectives, because that world looks very different. And thinking about, again, the kind of global popular and the force in this very moment that Hindi films had, both within and well outside of India.
Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah.
Can I just quickly respond to this? I think Sudha, your book actually captures something of this kind of fluid uh, translation of visual, artifactual, material objects, where though it is a manifestation of the Cold War in everyday life, but the reception of it is not actually based on that kind of bipolar conflict. It's so fluid that it's that messiness that we need to have understand, and not the sharp political lines that have framed that moment. We need to understand that messy quality which makes that period so interesting.
Thank you. Thank you all. And thank you, Ranjani. I'm glad somebody read my book. All right. We're ready for questions from the audience, I think, at this point.